Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce Lachine. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Tonight we're examining a bill that comes from the Senate, Bill S-10, an act to implement the Convention on Cluster Munitions. For a few weeks now, we have gathered here late at night to debate bills that the Conservative government wants to push forward. Although we in the official opposition are proud to rise to represent the interests of our constituents, to ask fundamental questions and to propose better solutions or concrete amendments, I wish to underscore that the process through which we are discussing S-10 tonight is unacceptable. The Conservative government is forcing Parliament to approve its bills as quickly as possible with time allocation. That's the 45th time today. Many last-minute votes as well. What happened to the time traditionally allocated for debate, in-depth examination in a nonpartisan way in parliamentary committees or government consultations with national and international experts? All these steps are essential for developing democratic legislation before having a vote in the Commons. I'm raising these procedural points on behalf of my NDP colleagues and myself, who will attempt to amend S-10 in committee. We oppose this bill as it stands because even though its title seems to indicate one thing, in reality it does not serve to implement the Convention on Cluster Munitions. S-10 opposes Canada to the 110 other signatory countries, including 68 that have already ratified it. S-10 will be a hiding place for the Conservative government. It's an attempt to have an exception to the Convention.
The NDP cannot support an approach that, in the words of the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, is timid, inadequate, and regressive. In order that all colleagues throughout this House be equally informed about the issue at hand, I'm going to attempt a definition of the various terms. The Convention on Cluster Munitions is an international humanitarian and disarmament treaty that prohibits the use, production, stockpiling, and transfer of this category of weapons and provides for their removal and their destruction. The 111 states that signed the Wellington Declaration participated in the Dublin meeting in Ireland, including Canada. The text of the convention was passed on the 30th of May 2008, and Canada signed the convention on the 3rd of December 2008. Under Article 2 of the convention, Canada committed to respecting that convention and respecting the clause on not producing these munitions, not fostering or encouraging anyone to engage in activities that include munitions. It committed to destroying munitions under this convention and in working in areas that include these munitions. It committed to providing assistance to victims of these cluster munitions, providing assistance to other party states as well, and taking all necessary legislative measures to implement the convention. Under Article 2, cluster munitions include classical munitions that are designed to disperse or release sub-munitions that are explosive and that weigh less than 20 kilograms. Cluster munitions were used in the field during the Second World War and in Afghanistan. These are weapons that release hundreds of explosives over a very broad area within a very short period of time. No one can escape it. And it's sad to say, Mr. Speaker, that 98% of all injuries linked to cluster munitions have been inflicted on civilians. According to the Cluster Munitions Coalition, most of the victims are children. Those are the ones who are attracted by the unexploded bomblets. They mistake them for toys, and many of them will die when they come into contact with these bomblets. The Conservative government wants to vote in a bill that will cancel out Canada's commitment to these victims of cluster munitions, not only past victims, but those of today and potential victims. Bill S-10 will invalidate the convention. It circumvents the clause on interoperability by allowing Canada to assist, encourage, counsel, and even conspire to use cluster munitions. Why is the government that negotiated and signed the convention in good faith in 2008 doing an about-face? Does the government not believe that we should practice what we preach? I'd like to congratulate all those Canadians who signed petitions calling upon the government to ban these cluster munitions. I'd like to congratulate my colleague from Edmonton, Strathcona, who received these petitions and tabled them in the House. Many citizens in our country are calling on the government to make amendments to Bill S-10, that no Canadians be liable in their involvement in the use, production, purpose, or sale of cluster munitions or their financial investments. They're calling on the Government of Canada to make its commitment positive and sustained and make it known. The population is also calling on the Government of Canada to acknowledge the huge impact of cluster munitions on civilian populations. No Canadians should ever have to be involved in the use or production or purchase of cluster munitions, regardless of where the conflict is. Canada must have the best legislation in the world. We should be leaders. The bill before us does not reflect that. I would encourage all to sign the petition on behalf of Handicap International. There are thousands of signatories on this petition. I'd like to congratulate the excellent work of my colleague. Did you know that there are unexploded cluster bombs all over the world and that these unexploded bombs kill 4,000 civilians every year? In 2006, 22 members of the Canadian Armed Forces were killed and 112 were injured in Afghanistan because of anti-personnel mines. These dangerous weapons are dangerous for many decades. S-10 is a failure when it comes to Canada's leadership, international leadership, and if it is passed in its current form, it will be the weakest in the world, Mr. Speaker, compared to those bills that were signed by other party states. The NDP has brought forward amendments, and these amendments could improve Canada's image and commitment to the convention. Why is the government undermining all these efforts, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, there have been better times. In 1997, thanks to Canada's leadership, there was an anti-mine treaty. It was called the Ottawa Convention, and it became the most ratified convention in history. I hope all my colleagues from all parties will support the NDP's efforts and amendments. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to quote Craig and Mark Kilberger then in an article they wrote. Craig and Mark Kielberger are exceptional Canadians, and they founded Free the Children, Mr. Speaker. They continue to motivate young people on a yearly basis to support peace building throughout the world.
We pay homage to Canadians who served and died to uphold global peace and freedom. What better way to honor these sacrifices than to advance peace by eliminating a weapon that kills and maims hundreds of children every year. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
The honourable member for Mississauga, Arundel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her speech. I'm going to ask her a question I asked her colleague who spoke previously, and her colleague unfortunately wasn't able to answer the question, I suspect because she hadn't taken the time to look at the UK legislation or the Australian legislation, which she said compared better to Canada. in terms of the interoperability provisions of Section 11. So I'm going to ask this member if she could take us through the UK legislation, the Australian legislation, and Section 11 of Bill S-10, and tell us how the Canadian legislation differs from the UK and Australian legislation in terms of allowing interoperability with states that do use cluster munitions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Député de Notre-Dame-de-Grâce.
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce Lachine. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I compared the proposed legislation in Canada to that of other countries because, according to many, this is very weak, and that's what I was trying to emphasize, Mr. Speaker. That's what I want to emphasize. We have a bill before us here, and we have a government before us here that refuses to ratify conventions that will save lives. So whether it has to do with Article 11 or any other article, when you compare this country to other countries, we have a government here that has really just bowed to American lobbying, American measures, and has decided to dilute its legislation and come up with weak legislation. I don't really need to compare it to all the other countries. We had a perfectly good convention that the government is refusing to ratify.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Speaker, and it's really so disingenuous to have a government member to ask another member in basically 30 seconds to compare a piece of legislation to two other countries. I mean, so absurd. We're here today debating this legislation that this government put forward as compared to the treaty. And that's what's important. And I think anything that you look at tells us that S-10 is undermining the very treaty that was signed by Canada. I'm very glad that my honourable colleague tonight raised the fact that there are thousands of young Canadians who have signed this petition. And I think it's really distressing that they had the best expectations for this government to bring forward a bill that would actually meet the spirit, the principle, the intent, the substance of that treaty, and yet this legislation has failed. So I'm very glad that she made the points that she did tonight, because I just think it shows how far removed this government has become from not only the feelings of Canadians, but even meeting the spirit and the substance of a treaty that Canada has signed.
The
Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce Lachine. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her remarks. Yes, it is unfortunate. We have a government here that is disconnected from the public. Since I've been here, we've tabled so many petitions, and all those petitions that I've tabled have never been welcomed by a government. We have a government that is very ideological. I've listened to the other speeches tonight. We have a government that is close-minded, that is ideological, that is not open to discussing amendments with us. And we've had many dealings with the government. We've had a record number of bills in this Parliament, and the government has is just on one track. It doesn't listen to the experts. It doesn't listen to Canadians who want to be heard, and it's really unfortunate. When I look at the participation of people at the ballot, it's quite unfortunate, but the government doesn't even realize that people aren't listening to it. It doesn't listen to the people. And it's really unfortunate that so many Canadians have called upon this government to ratify the convention, and the government is just simply not listening.
Resuming debate.